This is a presentation on an important subject, that of the social cycle. The social cycle concerns social dynamics, leadership, and social change or transformation. The social cycle is particularly good as a way of understanding that any society from any time in history will have a phase of benevolence and well-being for the people, as well as a phase of degeneration or exploitation of the people. This means there is a phase when those leading the society do so in a way beneficial to the welfare and well-being of the people that make up that society. In contrast, a phase is inevitably reached when those leading the society start to exploit the people for their own interests. Typically, this will be cumulative, that is, the exploitation will increase over time. For those guided by a humanist and neo-humanist outlook, it will be of great importance to understand the point at which degeneration and exploitation start in a society, since by knowing this, measures can be developed and taken to stop the degeneration and stop the exploitation. The theory of the social cycle is based on the work of Indian philosopher, spiritual teacher, and activist P.R. Sarkar. Okay, so let's turn to the first slide. The slide is going to be talking about 4 social psychologies. So before we go there, I want to just give a little introduction to this concept of social psychology. If we look at human history, at any point in human history, we will find that one type of mentality dominates the society. One type of dominant mentality prevails in the society. And when we look closely at that, we can delineate several of these social psychologies. One of them is that of the laborer. A second one is that of the warrior. A third one is that of the intellectual. And a fourth one is that of the merchant. So the idea here is everyone falls into one of these categories. It means one of those social psychologies dominates more than any other one. It doesn't mean that a person will not have various other qualities from these 4 social psychologies. It means that one is going to predominate, one is going to dominate. So the idea here is societies form around the prevalence of one of those psychologies. So at one point it may be the labor is prevailing. That would have been in early history. Eventually the laborer gets displaced by the warrior and form a society. The point comes where that warrior society, that society dominated by the warrior leadership, will fall into degeneration. And in that phase of degeneration, the conditions are met whereby a new psychology manages to arise and in one way or another oust that dominant psychology that had been in degeneration. And out of that situation, the new social psychology rises. Well, probably that would have been the intellectuals. And then we find that the same type of thing happens, that society being ruled by the intellectuals who had displaced the warriors, also gets to the point where it falls into decay, into degeneration. And the conditions are created whereby a new social psychology can rise up and challenge that decaying, decadent, degenerating social psychology and allow the new social psychology to rise. In this case, that of the merchant. Today, the word we would use more commonly for the merchant would, of course, be the capitalist, the entrepreneur. So this is the idea of this social cycle where we have these 4 social psychologies moving more or less in a cycle. Now, we do need to explain one point here. The laborer, although they will have prevailed in early human history, and let's call it an undeveloped phase of human history, they will not, once the warrior class has emerged, form the society. They will not have the capacity in the face of the other social psychologies to actually rule the society. So it will move more or less between the warrior, the intellectual, the merchant, and then the weight of the laborers is used to shift that from merchant dominated society in its phase of degeneration and move that back to the second phase or the second round of the rule of the warriors. So the labor plays an essential role in that transition out of the decaying, degenerating merchant era and through again back to the warrior era. Okay, so this again we call the social cycle. It's based more or less on yogic philosophy. So I want now to address a few points that we're going to explore in some slides. So basic principles of the social cycle. In the movement of the social cycle, one class is always dominant, as we've seen. The worker, warrior, intellectual, and merchant ages move in succession, followed by revolution. Now that was the phase coming out of merchant through the laborer revolution, worker revolution, and back on through to the second phase of the warrior society. The social cycle moves through phases of benevolence and exploitation. This part is very crucial for us to grasp. We can depict that graphically as the rise benevolently of a social psychology, of a ruling social psychology, it reaching a plateau point and then falling into the phase of retardation or degeneration, characterized by exploitation of that few against the many. So that would be in that malevolent phase or phase of exploitation. 4th point, spiritual revolutionaries, known as sadvipras, impact the social cycle to minimize the exploitative phases and maximize the benevolent phases. This part's very important. It's introducing literally a 5th category, the category of the sadvipra, the spiritual revolutionaries. So it's saying here, the role of these spiritual revolutionaries impacts this social cycle in such a way that the periods of benevolence are maximized and the periods of exploitation are minimized. So this slide is showing a succession of social psychologies forming a society, rising, reaching a plateau point, and then falling into retardation or degeneration. And out of that, the next social psychology rising. So the conditions in the phase of degeneration and that phase of retardation of the society, the conditions are created whereby the new social psychology gets the opportunity in either evolutionary or even revolutionary ways to come forward, to move forward, and to then form the successive society. Let's explain a little bit on this concept of intellectuals. We see here we've used the word priests. Why is that? That's because it's very often through the medium of the priest class, of the religious leadership class, of the clerics, that we see societies forming. So in the history of Europe, for example, that was for many centuries, in fact, the Catholic Church. And what is the dominant social psychology inside the Catholic Church? We would say that was that of the intellectuals, literally in the form of priests, in the form of the cleric class. So the idea here is they rose benevolently, they reached a plateau point, and then they fell inexorably into the phase of degeneration characterized by exploitation of the people, of the mass of the society. And again, out of that, the conditions were created where the next social psychology got the opportunity to rise, in this case, as depicted here on the graph, that being the merchants. Okay, here we've got a little bit more detail in what characterizes these social psychologies. So firstly, the laborer, those who dwell on matter. So the mind is directed at a very practical level of what's required to fulfill one's needs, one's desires on quite a practical, basic level. So the mind dwelling on matter. Warriors, those who control and dominate the material world and the members of society through physical power. It's their physical power, their physical attributes, their bravery that allows them to rise and form the society. The third social psychology, that of the intellectuals, those who control and dominate the material world and the members of society by intellectual means. In contrast to the warrior, where it was physical strength, it was strength of character in the form of bravery, in the form of courage. With the intellectuals, the dominant quality that enables them to control and dominate the society and the material world is by the intellect, by intellectual means. So we gave an example a moment ago about priests, the priest class. The fourth social psychology, that of the merchant, those who control and dominate the material world and the members of society by financial means, by economic means, by virtue of their ability to utilize resources and to create wealth from doing that. And through that capacity, that entrepreneurial capacity, they are able to access power and form a society. And of course, the society formed by each of these three dominant social psychologies is massively influenced in its form, in its style, and how it's appearing. It is very much related to the dominant social psychology that is leading that society. Okay, we have here a quotation. A fast change in the collective psychology is taking place in the human society. The value of intellect is considered much greater than that of physical strength. This intellect is not only with a handful of people, but it is in our collective life because of the development of intellect. The change in collective psychology will be very comprehensive and very quick. Okay, so again, this is talking about this collective psychology. And it's saying here that because the intellect has, in this phase of human history, been substantially developed, it has created the conditions whereby there can be a change in collective psychology that can be very comprehensive and very quick. Okay, this next diagram is showing the way in which this social cycle can be impacted by the Satvipra. Remember, the Satvipra were these spiritual revolutionaries. They were there as servants of the society, the people who had the qualities of all four social psychologies, that of the laborer, the worker, that of the warrior, that of the intellectual, that of the merchant. People who have reached the point where they have been able to see the value in all four of these social psychologies and consciously develop them in themselves. And because of that, they are integrated people capable of relating to all sectors of the society, that base their life on a powerful foundation of morality, of universal human ethics and moral principles. They have developed themselves physically, mentally, spiritually. They have developed the highest psychic, mental, intellectual faculties. But also they have developed the spiritual qualities through spiritual or intuitional practices, and are there as servants of the society. So this is this beautiful new category of social leaders known as Satvipras. This is a really important concept today, and as we look at what's been unfolding in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, I think we can see that we need a new level of leadership. We need leaders that are there to serve the society, not to serve themselves. A group of leaders that have actively, consistently worked to develop their higher human faculties we all have the potential to develop. So these are the wayfarers, the vanguard that have developed these qualities in themselves and are there as able, ready servants of the society. So I hope that sort of fits together clearly. We've got the natural flow of the social cycle moving through these phases of benevolent rule, followed by exploitation, followed by social transition, or even ultimately social revolution. And then the point coming where we get the advent of the Satvipra that checks the point of retardation or decline of the society, creates the circumstances where the new social psychology can rise up and in a benevolent direction of movement to serve the society. The coronavirus, COVID-19 world pandemic is happening also in terms of this social cycle, because there is one social psychology that is dominating most countries of the world today. Which one is it? Is it that of the laborer? Is it that of the warrior or the intellectual? Or is it the merchant? That's something interesting to reflect on and think about in the country that you're in. Where I'm sitting here today in Europe, it's very, very clear that the dominant social psychology here in Europe is that of the merchant. It is the merchant. The more common word we use for that is capitalist. So the system here is overwhelmingly capitalist, and in some countries that capitalist dominant psychology has been ruling for a very, very long time. In fact, it started emerging quite dramatically around 400 years ago. So back in the 1600s, the impact of the merchants started to stir in the society. And then within some small period of time, maybe a century, that psychology really managed to capture the society and then carry the world eventually into the Industrial Revolution. Again, very much a symptom of that entrepreneurial merchant / capitalist class. Now again, it's not to say any one of these social psychologies is bad. It's not about that. It's simply saying that they have a benevolent phase, they plateau, and then they will always go into decline, into degeneration, characterized by the exploitation of the people. And the question then arises is, if we are in the merchant phase, in fact, I need to qualify that because not all countries in the world are in the merchant phase. Certainly here in Europe, the dominant social psychology is that of the merchant, has been in many countries, in fact in Western Europe, for centuries. In other countries it works differently. For example, in China today, although we may call it state capitalist, it's likely that the ruling psychology of the Chinese Communist Party and leadership is still that of the warrior. So what we saw there historically is a transition to the warrior society in a way that Western Europe, for example, did not experience that the rule of the merchant prevailed through the phase in which countries like the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc of Europe, China, transitioned out of the phase of the merchant and into the phase, in fact, the second phase of the warrior. So, we have broadly seen that the dominant psychology globally is that of the merchant. Our world today is dominated by the merchant psychology in terms of the member countries that make up our world today. We have something called globalization, and that again is the globalization of the merchant agenda. We have political entities like the EU, European Union, and again, the psychology we find driving that, dominating it, since its arising was again that of the merchant. The question then arises is, what point in the social cycle of the merchant are we in? Is it rising benevolently? Has it plateaued? Has it moved into the period of retardation, degeneration, exploitation? And if it has, at what point in that cycle is that phase of degeneration, exploitation? In my analysis, it's very, very clear that we are indeed in the degenerative, retardative phase of the merchant era. I think if we're honest and we look around our own society and other merchant-dominated / capitalist societies, we will have to accept very, very clearly that we are in this phase of degeneration. And because of that, our merchant-dominated societies have taken on a certain form, and there's a certain direction of movement that is unfolding, that is coming from this dominant social psychology, that of the merchant.